السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أقل من 500 شخص يملكون أكثر من نصف الأراضي في اسكتلندا، معادلة تثير ملفا حارا وشائكا سياسيا وشعبيا، وما فتئت أصداؤها تتدحرج اليوم. الأرض في اسكتلندا، ومن يملكها ومن يستخدمها، وكيف جرى الاستيلاء عليها من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. في تشرين الأول أكتوبر عام 2012، وفي مزرعة قرب العاصمة الاسكتلندية إدنبرا، عثر على جثة المزارع المستأجر أندرو ريدل الذي كان يعمل هناك مع عائلته منذ أكثر من 100 عام. لكن مالك المزرعة الملياردير أليستر سالفنسون، ثالث أغنى رجل في اسكتلندا، أعطاه إشعارا بإنهاء خدماته وأمره بمغادرة المزرعة. ريدل رفع قضية لكنه خسرها، فما كان منه إلا أن أنهى حياته بعد جمعه آخر حصاد له في المزرعة نفسها التي ولد وترعرع وعمل فيها. هو الإقطاع في اسكتلندا معضلة تعاني منها البلاد اليوم، إذ يسيطر أقل من 500 شخص على أكثر من نصف الأراضي الاسكتلندية، وهذا يشكل بالتالي بحسب الأكاديميين والمتخصصين في استصلاح الأراضي نمطاً يعد الأكثر تركيزاً لملكية الأراضي في العالم المتقدم. في هذا السياق تم تأسيس مجموعة مراجعة الإصلاح الزراعي من قبل الحكومة الاسكتلندية في هوليرود عام 2012 بهدف تمكين عدد أكبر من الشعب في المناطق الريفية والمدنية الاسكتلندية من أن يكون لهم حصة في ملكية الأراضي وحكمها وإدارتها واستخدامها، الأمر الذي سيؤدي إلى تنوع أكبر في ملكية الأرض وأنواع الملكية في اسكتلندا. جل ما يقال إن هذا كان اعترافاً بأن هذه السلطة المركزة والثروة في أيدي عدد قليل جداً من الشعب الاسكتلندي أضحت ببساطة غير قابلة للاستمرار في اسكتلندا الحديثة، ناهيك عن كونها سيئة للاقتصاد الريفي بحسب المراقبين. هيثر أندرسون مزارعة وناشطة من إدنبرا، والمزارع بيت ريتشي يحدثاننا من الداخل عن معضلة إصلاح الأراضي والسيطرة عليها، ولماذا تعلو الأصوات اليوم أكثر في هذا الملف، وماذا عن القوانين المتعلقة بهذه القضية، ومن يملك اسكتلندا اليوم. Heather Anderson, farmer and campaigner from Edinburgh, Scotland. Welcome to Min الداخل from the inside, ma'am.
Thank you.
Always welcome, ma'am. Now, let's start with the issue, a very important and thorny issue here in Scotland nowadays. It's an old, new issue, which is that of land reform and land grab. Observers claim that more than half of Scotland is owned by fewer than 500 people. Now, what does that statement mean, Heather?
Well, that's a very deep statement. 432 people own half of Scotland, and the problem is they have owned it forever. So feudalism arrived in Scotland in 1150. It is still alive and well in Scotland, so a very few number of people own the land. It's been held in the same hands. The estate is passed on to the oldest son. So the estates aren't broken up, they remain intact. So people have huge tracts of land. They've kept it for hundreds of years, and now they get huge amounts of subsidy from the European Union to keep owning that land. And I think in our history, the big shift was in 1750, the 1750s, where we had an agricultural revolution, and most people were moved off of the land. So in the north of Scotland we had the Highland clearances, and in the south of Scotland we had the enclosures. So basically in the 1750s we moved from a run rig system of agriculture, subsistence agriculture, to the land being a source of rent as opposed to being the source of an army. We'd had the unification with England in 1707, and suddenly land was a source of rent. So the enclosures meant that all the subsistence farmers were moved off the land. The farms were enlarged, so the farm that you're sitting on today got the shape that it has now in 1748, and we're still living with that.
Now, Heather, thank you for this overview, historical overview of the issue of the land, but why is it a case today? I mean, why do you make lots of hassle about the issue of those people owning this land, and then you have a problem with that?
I think we had a referendum about independence 2 years ago,
Right.
and for the 2 years before that there was a huge amount of engagement in thinking about the country we wanted Scotland to be, what kind of society we'd want to have in Scotland, and that made a lot of people begin to question the way things are. So there was a lot of discussion in the referendum about having an egalitarian, civically just society. And you suddenly realise that all of your land is privately owned, and that for 200 years most ordinary people in Scotland have not had access to land to produce food. Land is extremely expensive. We don't grow our own food. We import a huge amount of food to feed people in the cities, but we're not connected to our land as a source of food for ourselves. So I think part of the dissatisfaction was increased in the last few years when people think, why is that the case?
But you, Heather, and Pete, your husband also, you were not farmers at the beginning. You came from an urban life and moved to the rural side of Scotland, and you got engaged in this. Tell us about that experience, please.
We had always lived in the city, and we moved here in the year 2000. And it's not until you come to own a farm that you begin to think consciously about land and looking after land and growing food. And then in the area where we are in Scotland, there are huge landowners who own most of the area, and you begin to realise that this is a feudal society. So in the referendum, for example, many people many ordinary people wouldn't vote for independence because they thought it would offend the landowner. So we had this ridiculous situation in 2014 where ordinary people were anxious and resistant to voting for independence because they thought it would offend the landowner. And that was a real shock to me as someone who came from the city to even believe that people could think like that. So it's a very powerful psychological control. So it's not explicit, it's just in people's heads.
Right. On the other hand, some justify why so few people own land in Scotland as, quote, it's because so much of the land is unproductive wilderness. And the Earl of Seafield thinks that it is a myth that too few people own too much, and there is very little evidence to show this is a bad thing. Your take, please.
Yeah, 85% of the land in Scotland is less favoured area, so it basically grows grass and heather. But that doesn't mean that people can't farm it. That doesn't mean that those rural areas can't be repopulated. So at the moment, we have 400,000 deer in Scotland for recreational hunting, right? But we're not using any of that livestock as a source of protein to feed the children who go to schools in Glasgow. So there's this whole issue about what are we using our land for, who are we growing food for, could we manage the land better, and could we feed the people in Scotland better by redistributing some of that ownership and some of that control. So I would like to say to the Lord, let's have a shot at working out how we can do that better and how we can actually benefit from that land as opposed to using it as a background for a hobby.
Do the people who own the land understand that they can, for example, today, let's not talk about what happened in the past, but today, for example, some people who have inherited the land, do they understand the importance? Are they that attached to their land?
I think it would be very varied. So I think there are some people who would be considered to be good custodians of the land. There are some who will be very absent and neglect their tenants. So part of the difficulty is if you're a tenant farmer, you yourself can't develop your land because you've got no access to capital. You can't borrow money because you've got no security. So we've got a huge number of farmers in Scotland who can't develop or diversify or expand their businesses because they're tenants. They've got no control. And if you've got a bad landlord, you're in a very vulnerable situation.
To what extent, Heather, today, or to what depth, let's say, the land reform debate in Scotland is based more on prejudice than on fact? This debate, we always
It's certainly based on fact, and it's certainly based on an increased consciousness of what kind of country do we live on, who owns Scotland, who's it farmed for, what do we want to do with that land. So it's part of a political discourse about what kind of country we want to be and how we want to see power and control influenced. So any country, in Scotland, the people are sovereign in the Scottish Parliament, and part of this reconnection with land is about making the people in land be sovereign. And I think any country would understand why we want to do that.
Land means power. Let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of those aristocrats. How would they digest the idea of losing control over their land?
I think there is incredibly well organised resistance to change. They have a very good track record of protecting their interests. The biggest threat that they face currently is the vote to leave the European Union, which completely unsettles everything we know to be true about subsidy, land management, viability of farming. So we are just about to enter very, very interesting times when anything could happen, because everything changes with Brexit.
Right. Let's talk about the nuances that you have when it comes to the issue of, exiting the European Union or having another referendum of separation of Scotland from the UK and staying with the European Union, because this is what the Socialist Nationalist Party Scottish Nationalist Party, talked about. What are the challenges that you might face when it comes to the issue of land reform?
I think the issue of land reform is about reconnecting the people of Scotland with what their land is for and how it can best be used, both in terms of the environment and in terms of food production and in terms of rural employment. So I think there is a deep disconnect from the people who live in the cities and their land because they've not been connected or used to it for 250 years. The Aboriginal people were taken away from their land but haven't forgotten. The Native American Indians lost their land but haven't forgotten, but Scotland has. And it's a very, very deep and old disconnect. So I think there is a real issue about getting people excited about food production, management of land, environmental issues, and giving them the power to do that well.
Right, Heather, I would like to explore with you how far is the Scottish land reform issue connected to the Scottish history, to the culture of Scotland?
The history of land is the history of our culture. So our whole understanding of who we are is from our connection with land. So we have been exporting food for other people for 200 years and not feeding ourselves well. We have been an industrialised urban country, disconnected from the power and dignity of producing food for yourself. We have a terrible diet and bad health. And partly for me, I always tell a story about how the people who worked on this land in 1750 had a very healthy diet. And then they went to Edinburgh and Glasgow and they worked in tenements in the Industrial Revolution and they ate white bread and jam. So as a result of the slave trade, we suddenly started eating sugar and white bread, and our diet's gone downhill ever since. And we've never reconnected with growing our own food and being responsible for our own health.
And today, where are you concerning the land reform?
I think there's a hugely exciting prospect of reconnecting people with what that might mean for them and transforming rural communities as well as urban communities.
Heather Anderson, farmer and campaigner from Edinburgh, Scotland, many thanks indeed for joining us, and we'll be joined with your husband, who's also a farmer, Pete Ritchie, to talk about the two land reform acts, which is that of 2003 and 2016, and what's coming next for Scotland concerning the land reform, but after the break. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
بيت ريتشي المراقب والمزارع الاسكتلندي يحدثنا عن مسألة إصلاح الأرض والقانونين، الأول الذي سن عام 2003 والثاني في عام 2016، وما الفارق بينهما.
We've had 2 acts, we're going to have more acts because it will take a generation at least to reform land in Scotland. The first act in 2003, what most people would have noticed in Scotland was that suddenly they had the right to roam. They could go on anybody's land. They can't go into their house, but they can walk on their land. So on this farm here,
and they can camp and
they can camp. If somebody here wants to come here, they can ride a horse across the land, they can ride a bicycle across the land. They can't drive across the land in a car, but they can walk, and as long as they, don't run into a cow or something, they'll be all right. And that's a huge change, because it's suddenly saying, look, you may own the land, but you can't tell people they can't walk on your land.
So it's a good thing.
It's a really good thing, and it's starting to open up access to land.
What about the 2016?
Well, that's
which came after the Land Reform Review Group was established back in 2012.
That's right, and that's part of a much bigger change, because land law in Scotland has treated land differently from other things. So you can pass it on to your son, as Heather said, intact. You don't have to divide it up among your children. So if you've got a daughter, tough luck, she doesn't get any. You don't pay tax if it's being farmed. So there's lots of other ways in which land is treated differently. And the 2016 Act is starting to reduce those changes. So we're going to see land much more. You can't just pass it on to your first son anymore, although landlords are wrapping it up in trusts and finding ways of still doing that. And they're also trying to avoid tax, as they always do. But the big change, I think, with the new land reform is starting to see land as something which is to be used for the public good and in the common interest. So suddenly seeing the land of Scotland as something which really should benefit everybody in Scotland, not just the people who own it. So there's a new duty on landlords for sustainable development. In keeping with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, landlords have to make sure their land is being used for sustainable development. And
how are the landlords, Pete, interacting with these acts?
They grumble a lot.
I mean, they are used to control everything, and then all of a sudden people come to their land and they cannot say no to them. You have to go away.
They grumble a lot. They think they can keep things very much the way they are, and that there won't be much real change in land ownership in the next generation. And they may be right. It's going to take a bold government to start taxing land, but maybe we'll have a bold government. Certainly, since this Act, there's a new land commission going to be set up. It's going to draw up a statement of rights and responsibilities in land that will then be the basis for new laws going forward. And we've certainly seen that the change is now, if somebody's got a piece of land and it's not being used sustainably, then actually the communities around that land can insist on acquiring that land. They can buy it compulsorily.
And through the Act, they have the right to do this.
And they have the right to do that. Now, it hasn't been tested in the courts yet, and I'm sure there'll be long legal battles, but the principle that you can't just own land and do what you want with it, that's a really important challenge to this idea that I own the land, I can do anything I like, and it's nobody else's business. So in Scotland we're saying, actually, it's everybody's business, and everybody has a stake in all of the land. So that's a big change. We've also seen a big change in the last 10 years in community groups owning land. We already have a lot of conservation charities that own land, and now community groups also own about 2% of Scotland's land, and we want to see that grow as well. And what you've seen since community groups have started owning land is they're investing in land, people are making decisions jointly about what to do with the land, you're seeing new people move into the land, you're seeing new housing being created in rural areas, and slowly, we're seeing a repopulation of Scotland's rural areas. And most excitingly, young people in Scotland who couldn't wait to leave their island or leave their remote part of Scotland are now saying, we want to make our future here. So for 200 years, we've lost our young people. They've gone to England, they've gone to America, they've gone to Australia, they've gone to South Africa, they've gone all over the world. And now for the first time in 200 years, young people are wanting to stay in Scotland and make this their home.
This is very interesting.
Really important change, and land's at the heart of
Why
that.
do you think that this change is happening now, for example? Because usually the youth, they decide to leave their countryside and to head to the city to get more modernized and, you know, to live this kind of life.
Well, I think part of it, inevitably, there's the global recession. Part of it is definitely the internet, that you can be connected to the world. You don't have to necessarily live in the middle of the city to meet other people, to talk to other people. But I think it's also in Scotland a real sense that this is a country which is changing. In the last 30 years, when I first came back to Scotland, my grandfather was Scottish, you know, we had prejudice against people who were gay, we had prejudice against people from different cultures, women had no place in public life in Scotland. All of that has changed in 30 years, and Scotland has gone from being really quite a backward-looking country in many ways to being a very progressive country. And I think young people are excited by that.
Right. Tell us about the incidents, the bad incidents that took place, one of which, the most recent, that somebody committed suicide because of this issue of the land problems.
Andy Whiteman, who's campaigned for this for years, MSP now, he wrote a book saying the poor have no lawyers. And that's been the crux of land in Scotland. The rich people have been able to employ lawyers to get their way, and it's still happening. So this was a tenant farmer who wanted to pass the farm on. I think he didn't have a son who could immediately inherit. I think it was a grandson he wanted to pass it to. I can't remember the details. The point was, he couldn't win the case in court because the landlord had more money and better lawyers. And in the end, it was like, you're going to have to leave your farm where you spent your entire life, you've put all your working life into this, you're going to have to leave. And he couldn't face it. So he brought the harvest in, and then he killed himself.
And one last thing, I asked this to Heather and I ask it to you. Where is Scotland going concerning the issue of land reform? Why?
This is
the why is very contentious, but why?
Yeah. It's a defining issue in terms of sovereignty. A nation can't be independent and sovereign if it has no control over who owns its land. At the moment, Scotland doesn't even know who owns some of its land, and we have no control over how much people can own, where in the world they can come from to own our land, whether we even know their names or what they do with it. We need to change that, because if a country doesn't take charge of its own land, then it can't take charge of its own destiny.
Right, Pete Ritchie, very well said. Scottish farmer and observer, many thanks indeed for joining us.
You're very welcome.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@الميادين.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل، من كل فريق عمل من الداخل، من كل الميادين من أدنبرا في اسكتلندا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.